Good morning, everyone. My name is Maxwell Okello. I'm the CEO of the American Chamber of Commerce, and I will be moderating this morning's webinar. It is great to see such a huge turnout from across the membership and beyond. I would like to acknowledge the presence on the call today of our board president, AmCham board president and general manager, Coca-Cola East and Central Africa, Philippine Tiki, our board vice president and IBM Government and Regulatory Affairs Executive for Central, East and West Africa, Humphrey Lilech. Other board members present, namely Brenda Mbathi, CEO of GE East Africa, Diane Jones, the Commercial Counselor, Foreign Commercial Service, the US Embassy, and others who I'm sure will be joining the call as we move along. I would also like to acknowledge the presence of the chairman of the Kenya Private Sector Alliance, COCEPSA, as it's commonly known, and General Manager of IBM East Africa, Nick Nesbitt. I'd also like to acknowledge the presence of USAID Mission Director, Kenya and East Africa, Mark Messick. Ladies and gentlemen, welcome to this webinar. Before we begin, I want to make a few quick announcements. This webinar will be 1 hour long. The audio, your audio and video will remain muted for the session. For good order, the speakers will run through their presentations and then take questions at the end. If you have questions, please type them in the Q&A tab at the bottom of your Zoom window. So I want to begin by first thanking all of you for making time to attend and a special thank you to our good member, Boston Consulting Group, or BCG, as they are known, for partnering with us on this webinar and agreeing to share their insights, being at the forefront of helping businesses across the world with shared and unique, businesses across the world deal with shared and unique challenges faced at this time. As business leaders, I know that some, if not most of us, are still collecting our jaws from the floor, wondering what just hit us. All the great plans we had for 2020 have just been upended. Now we can't even meet in person, let alone meet our targets. We know that operations in certain sectors have quite literally ground to a halt. Such is the case with international travel and tourism across the world and the hospitality industry. Practically all sectors are being impacted. Slumping sales and unstable supply chains are the order of the day. The full economic and financial impact is yet to be known. But still, we have to plod on. As leaders, we have to look at not just how we manage through the crisis, but also beyond the crisis. And that is why this morning's session is important. How do we as businesses navigate the immediate and evolving challenges presented by COVID-19? How do we adjust and survive, all the while maintaining a future outlook on the recovery phase? Because we have to be prepared for that as well. So to talk to us about this and other aspects, we have 3 speakers this morning. I will introduce Mills, who will introduce the other 2 speakers. So Mills Schenk is the head of BCG's Nairobi office. He is a core member of BCG's corporate finance and strategy practice area and has deep experience in corporate strategy, covering growth, portfolio, M&A, and investor strategy across a range of industries, including healthcare, financial services, and consumer goods. Mills has advised multiple Kenyan-based companies on strategy development and planning, incorporating global best practices and local market dynamics to drive value creation. He also has experience supporting nonprofit organizations and large-scale donors on global health and development strategies in East Africa. With that, I'll quickly turn it over to you, Mills. Thank you.
Great. Thank you, Maxwell, and thank you to everyone on the phone. We're excited to have the opportunity to share our perspectives with you today. As Maxwell mentioned, I lead our business in East Africa and have the pleasure of being joined today by 2 panelists. We have François Candelon, who's a managing director and senior partner from our Paris office, Importantly, François is the global director of BCG's Henderson Institute, which is essentially our think tank that has been driving a lot of our sort of cutting edge thinking around COVID. And he's going to talk to us today about the economic impact of COVID globally. We also have Thomas Palm. Thomas is a managing director and partner from our China team. He works in industrial goods and auto and has been actively involved in helping Chinese companies navigate the COVID crisis, and we'll share some of those learnings today. So let me just quickly cover the agenda. We're gonna do sort of 3 15-minute chunks. François is gonna start by talking about the global economic impact. I'll talk about the current situation in Kenya and how we're thinking about the economic impact and a framework for leaders to think about driving the recovery. And then Thomas will talk about the China response as well. And then hopefully we'll have some time at the end to be able to take some questions. I know people submitted a few questions in advance. So with that, let me turn it over to François to talk about the global economic impact of COVID-19.
Thank you so much. So it's really a pleasure to be with you, and I think that as we are on the same planet, it's very important that each of us has, let's say, a good understanding on what happens. As you say, there is a sideration phase. How do we go out of that? And it is true that we have at the moment something which is of an enormous, let's say, complexity. The level, the fractal element, the complexity is almost fractal. And of course, you have the disease, which is mostly, let's say, linked to the disease intensity and the shape. How will it go? How long will it last? Which has impact on the economy. I will come back to that and how we at BCG look at the economy, both with shock intensity and the shock shape. And of course, it has impact on some sectors. Some are extremely, let's say, fragile, like travel and tourism and so on. And of course, it has impact as well on companies. So how should you, as a leader, think about it? And I think that first, I would like to say something which is positive, if I may, which is the fact that in every downturn, some companies are able to win, or at least to go through the shock. For instance, we did an analysis around the, let's say, the last 4 downturns, and we found that 14%, 1/4, of companies were able to both improve their revenues and their margin, and overall 50% are able to at least increase one of them. So we have a very difficult environment, and you need to try to understand this environment, but the fate and the destiny of your company is in your own hands. If you move to the next slide, and if we can have a look at where we are. It's difficult to know exactly where COVID-19 will be from an epidemic, let's say, intensity. But what is for sure is that the way to look at that, and this is something you will need to monitor, is about the intensity, the death as a percentage of population, and the shape. Will it be for, let's say, a year, 2 years, whatever? At the moment, when we look at where we are probably, in terms of intensity, between the Hong Kong flu and the Spanish flu, around 0.8%. And for the duration, based on work we do with the WHO, the point is to say that we should have, let's say, we won't have anything really fully done before we get a good vaccine, which should happen in 12 to 18 months. So let's say first half of 2021. So which means that we will have to live with this virus for a long time. And so the question we have is, how will it impact? And if you can move to the next slide. And what is very important is, how do we manage it, and how do, let's say, leaders, governments, policymakers work with this? So as you can see, there are many different ways to live with this. Some were done in, let's say, Northeast Asia, in Southeast Asia, where they tried step after step to have either to have precision quarantine and surveillance. You have, let's say, some other choices which are made with shield immunity and so on. But what is for sure is that the social disconnection, let's say the social distancing, kills the virus and kill the economy. But it's very often what we've seen, it's better to start early with strong social distancing if you don't have the ability to do it differently through precision quarantine because you have tests, you have masks and so on. It's better to start early and to make it much shorter. This is, for instance, what we've seen in China, where you can separate, I would say, Hubei from the rest of China, and social distancing was quite successful in the rest of China. But as we can see, of course, it has the way governments will play and policymakers will decide to deal with this will have a massive impact on economy. And at least in the West, we can see that we will have three phases, I would say. We have the current lockdown. We'll have a transition phase for 12 to 18 months that we can call a transition phase where we'll have to live with the virus, and therefore we'll try to mitigate the impact on the economy, and therefore we will have immunity certificates, we'll try to have precision quarantine and so on. But trying to limit the expansion of the virus for the second wave. We should not forget that the Spanish flu had 3 waves and that the second one was the deadliest one. So if you move now to the next slide, basically, I'm sure that you've been able to look at all your alphabet with V, U, L, how it is, and so on. So usually when you have a sanitary, let's say, crisis like this one, we have a V effect, okay? So you lost output, but then you are back to the post-shock and there is no more lost output. At the moment, everyone is trying to stay there. The second part is a U, which is the main risk. And what happens there is the fact that you lost the output, then you come back to the same slope, but you have a perpetually lost output. And for instance, it is said that at the moment, as the U was, for instance, the crisis in 2008, you lost around $2 trillion US so you have a perpetually lost output. And then you have the L, which is still unlikely, which is what has happened, for instance, in Greece after the crisis, the euro crisis. And really, this is an irreparable damage, and you are then on a very different slope. If you move now to the next slide, because I think the next slide is really the way at BCG we look at it. It's a little bit as if you go to your optician or your ophthalmologist, because we need to look at 2 things. We have the geometry of the shock, as I mentioned, the V, the U, the L, and you have the intensity of the shock. And what we can say is that the intensity is something we have never seen recently, and it would almost make 2008 as a small incident. In France, every month we lose 3% of GDP. And therefore, if you consider a relatively easy, let's say, scenario where you say, okay, I am at 50% of, let's say, for a month when we are locked down, and we have 2 to 3 months based on what we've seen in Hubei, then we are maybe at 75% for 10 months. Based on what we can expect on what we see, let's say the rebound in China, or what we see in Singapore and so on. So we can see that probably the impact will be around 10+%. Therefore, it's something that was not done, for instance, in Europe since World War II. So we will need to think about it. And at the moment, all the challenge of our policymakers and our governments or central banks and so on, is to try to make sure that we avoid to move from the V to the U. We know the intensity is huge, nothing comparable, nothing similar to what we've seen, but then we still have a question about this, this view. So now, if you move to the next slide, and I think that it's a very important point on this chart. We have two things. We have, because the risk to come to a U is twofold. On the left-hand side, it's, okay, how do we avoid this, let's say, real economy freeze to become, of crisis, to become a financial crisis? And to do that, we have, let's say, tools, we have policies and so on, and we can see that on the monetary policy, if you take the Fed, if you take the European Central Bank, the ECB and so on, we are trying to play at the right level and with, let's say, I would say, tools that are somewhat known. The depths and the how big they are is unique, but at least we know how to try to avoid through the, to ensure the banking system is liquid. Banks were a bit stronger after the crisis of 2008. They had to have more, let's say, more capital, more collateral. So we can say that it will be tough, but it is something that is somewhat, we know how to deal with it. The real danger being, of course, a massive failure and massive bankruptcies from companies. On the other front, the risk to come to a U is if we have a real economy freeze for a long time, massive bankruptcies and so on, and a lack of formation of capital. But here, to try to avoid this, we are a bit in uncharted territories. Uncharted in two ways. The first one is that first, we don't know. There are questions about, let's say, helicopter money, many of these things, and that's great potentially, at least on paper, because we don't exactly know how it works and how it will be, how successful it would be. And the second thing is because we don't have very often the ways and the processes to make this money come to the people and the companies, the households and the companies that that need it. And I think that here we face a real complexity, and this is probably where every government on its fiscal policy and so on needs to be, let's say, as active as possible to make sure that this money will go to the places that need it and to avoid massive bankruptcies. If you move to the next slide. I think that nevertheless, as business leaders, we need to think about that. Okay, and what do we do with it? So first of all, I think that you need to find in different time horizons, and you need to start from now. Of course, you need to react and to make sure that you solve short-term people, customers, and business challenges, that you have business continuity, that you deal with your, let's say, with your employees and so on. So this is something which is important. But at the same time, you need to start and to prepare for the rebound and the resilience. What I mean by that is that during this transition phase, you will need to try to find opportunities to grow top and bottom line. You will need to identify weak signals that are really important for your market. And for instance, I know, let's say, some a French luxury brand, which is actually, the company is really looking at what happens, for instance, on Google search per category and so on. And they found a correlation between the Google search and what is spent a few days later. So I think that it allows them to have better scenarios. The third part is now as well about the new normal that will happen second half of 2021, and basically you need to rethink your operating model your portfolio of offers. As I said, so I spent the last 7 years in China before moving back to Europe. And as you probably know, in Chinese, the word crisis is made of two characters. The first one means danger, but the second one means opportunity. And I think that you need, it's a moment not only, of course, to prepare and to make sure that you are resilient, but as well to find opportunities to grow top and bottom line. And if you want, later on, I'm actually writing a paper with a former French Chief of Defense Staff to see what the link and how to prepare for that, and what are the first lessons we get, not only from military when we are at war, but as well when with some of our clients, what we do in terms of these scenarios. I want to give you one more minute maybe on this notion of scenarios. I think that we're at a moment when forecasting is in a sense useless, because there is so much uncertainty that you need to think in terms of scenarios, and you don't need to be too specific, but really to try to understand the drivers for your own business. And you need to look at it per country, per categories, and to say, okay, what will the impact be, and what can I see in this, let's say, in being, let's say, the mitigation, or as I said, the Google search or whatever, depending on your business. What can I see to anticipate and to get a little bit more impact on my, a little bit more view on what I'm discussing, and what could give me visibility on my business. I think that the ability for you to have what we call the Huda loop, which is for let's say fighters, which is observe, orient, decide, act. Your ability in a company to make it happen at a faster pace is absolutely critical. If you move to the next slide. And so I think that what you need to keep in mind, and as I said, even today, you need to start to think about what will happen after the crisis. What can be the lessons learned? How will consumers shift? What could be the new behavior? We see much more online and so on, and unmet needs. So I think that you need to think about it, and it is valuable, and it is a transition. Then you will have Thomas talking a bit later on that, which is absolutely critical to look at what happens in Northeast Asia, in Asia, in emerging markets from that region as well, so that you are in a better position then to anticipate what will happen. Anticipation, speed in the OODA loop, and so on will be absolutely critical. And these are the then the companies that will get and be much stronger out of this crisis. So there is still hope.
Great, thanks so much, Francois. So this is Mills again, and I'll now cover the situation in Kenya and some early perspectives on how the disease is progressing and what we think the economic impact might be. I think everyone knows the data on page 13 relatively well. So here we're looking at the number of cases on the x-axis and the case growth on the y. And, I think, everyone's reading the news, and so seeing that, the US, has advanced quite rapidly in terms of cases, and the case growth is still strong. Same is true in, other parts of Europe. I think what the data would tell us about Africa is that it is still relatively early in terms of the virus spread, although we'll talk also in a minute about the impact of testing and, how good of a handle we really have on it. The downside for Africa being early is that, the worst is yet to come. The upside, though, is that there's a lot we can learn from the responses from other countries, both in terms of the health and the business response. And that was part of the logic today of talking a little bit about China. On page 14 here, we're looking at the number of cases since the first case was detected. And so the y-axis here is a log scale, which gets a little misleading when you start getting far out in time horizons. But there's 3 points I want to make on this chart. And the first is if you look at Kenya at day 27, there were 179 cases, progressing roughly as you would expect it to progress. There's a lot of discussion about warm weather and different demographics and how the disease will actually progress in places like Kenya. But I think so far it's a little too early to tell. The second point I want to make is, and François made mention of this as well, is that containment measures can be effective. And so, if you look at Singapore, they were able to hold the number of cases very low for quite some time. There's been a recent acceleration, but the measures that they put in place were successful in containment, at least for some period. The other successful example is South Korea, low case count until about day 30. 2 outbreaks in very specific areas. I think everyone has read about the church, and then they went in and did these sort of micro lockdowns with aggressive testing and tracing, and that was quite successful. And then the last thing I want to say is that the situation can change rapidly. And so particularly when we look at Italy, I think everyone's been reading, but from day 20, they went from under 10 cases in Italy to almost 10,000 by day 40. And I think the implication of that is very much aligned with what François said, which is that there's so much uncertainty that, projecting, point estimates is really pointless. You have to think about scenarios, how those scenarios can impact your business, how to navigate liquidity, in downside scenarios. And I think that's just the reality of the way that we're seeing the virus spread. So if I go to the next page, I want to caveat this by saying something about testing, which again, there's a very strong correlation, unsurprisingly, between the robustness of testing infrastructure and the number of tests you're running across geographies, and then the number of cases that you actually confirm. And so, here we're looking at the same chart, but for East Africa, we see Kenya accelerating more rapidly than neighboring geographies. When I look at Ethiopia and Tanzania, I have real questions around, is disease progression slower there, or is it just a different testing scenario? Frankly, the same question exists in Kenya, where testing so far has focused mostly on quarantine patients and really hasn't gone out into the community, which I think is sort of the next phase. So again, just a lot of uncertainty, but certainly, we expect there to be a quite a regional impact. So what about the economic impact, and what could that look like in Kenya? And this is not a perfect comparison, and so it's not a terribly scientific analysis, but I think it is somewhat instructive. So what we're showing here is the total shareholder return of public companies in specific industries in the US, and we're showing it during the crisis phase. So this is when the disease was just starting to spread in the US. And it's not a perfect analog for Kenya. That said, I think there are some similarities, and I think that it's not unreasonable to believe that the impact across similar industries would be the same in Kenya. And so, if we translate what we saw in the U.S. to Kenya, we see big impacts like transport and tourism. That's obviously already the case here with travel bans, with hotels closing, with Kenya Airways struggling. In other economies, we see agriculture not being hit as much because, obviously Kenya, though, has very strong exports. And so, when things like flour and tea and coffee, we're not able to export those, that's going to have a big impact. And then we're seeing, significant disruption in manufacturing supply chain. I think at one point, imports from China were down by almost 40%, which impacts, a lot of downstream things in the supply chain. And then, a smaller impact on certain sectors like telco, like, basic household products. The good news, though, and we're looking here at the next page, is that industries bounce back, although they tend to do so, with different shapes and at different rates. And Tomas will cover this shortly, but essentially we're talking here about, it's the same data. So it's shareholder return in China from the end of January and so basically through the crisis phase. And again, we're seeing recoveries at different rates. So when we look at the Kenya GDP that falls into these buckets, we would say that, roughly a third. So we'd expect about a third to suffer, a minor hit and come back. The big caveat there is that agriculture is in that number. And so there's a big question as to how agriculture bounces back. But we're seeing a full third of the economy, namely manufacturing, tourism, energy, transportation, where I think businesses will be slower to recover, or at least that's what the China experience would tell you. And again, to translate this to the business implication, as a business leader, I think you need to have a view of what the shape of the downturn and what the shape of the recovery will look like. And you need to build scenarios around that. And so again, we're all learning from the experience of other companies and other countries, and there's tremendous uncertainty. But I think at least having a view of the experience, that other economies have had is instructive. So on this page, we're teeing up how BCG is framing the business response to COVID. And Thomas will talk in a minute about a practical application of this in China, but essentially we're thinking about the managerial response in 4 buckets. So team health and safety, certainly in the short and medium term, business strength, which is all about P&L management, cost containment, financial resilience, particularly for the hardest hit sectors like tourism, like transportation, and then executional clarity. And we're thinking about this in 3 different time horizons. So right now, I think in Kenya, there's a tremendous amount of focus, justifiably so, on tackling immediate priorities. Then it's about preparing for the rebound and recognizing the rebound, and then ultimately pursuing more structural enhancements and taking advantage of any opportunities that result from short-term disruptions. I won't drain page 19. This is just a little bit of a deeper dive into some of the buckets, but a lot of what we've been talking to business leaders about is team health and safety. So how do we help our employees reduce the risk of transmission? How do we enable them to comply with government regulations around curfews, et cetera? Business strength, we've talked about, big focus on maintaining revenue where possible and, having scenarios based on cost containment. On the financial resiliency side, it's really all about managing cash and liquidity, and I think that's where the scenario planning comes into play. So you need to be pressure testing your liquidity in severe downturns, and then also trying to set up signposts that allow you to invest as we come out of the recovery. And then on executional clarity, and Tomas will talk more about this, but we're seeing a lot of clients sort of stand up dedicated COVID response teams, to manage the crisis as not a standalone, but certainly as a dedicated focus area. And then I just want to make one quick plug for our BCG Corona site, which is listed here at the bottom. There's great content there that I would encourage everyone to take a look at. We've got a number of sector-specific perspectives, and so how should industries like telco, like airlines, think about navigating the crisis? We've got sort of daily updates on analytics around the virus and the economic impact. We've got various papers, and then some of these tools and frameworks we've also posted there, which I think are useful ways of thinking and checklists for business leaders to think about the crisis. So please visit the website or send me an email offline, and I'm happy to provide any of this. So with that, let me turn it over then to Tomas to talk about the lessons from the China response.
Great. Thanks for having me. I'm Thomas, and I'm based in Beijing. Maybe if you go to the next slide. So as you all probably know, is that China was the first being hit by the virus, but China was also the first to getting out of the crisis again. As it stands now, it looks the daily number of new cases it's actually been reduced to a very low amount, and most of the cases happening in China now are imported from abroad by people coming home. If you look at the economy, and that is on this current slide 23, it's true, China is really getting back to speed. Almost all, 99% of industrial companies have resumed operation by the end of March. Coal consumption is back to 85% of what it was before the crisis at the same time last year. 83% of the congestion is back. You would not have believed it, but the first time I was back in the 2-hour traffic jam here in Beijing, it actually felt kind of good. But I can promise you, you will get annoyed by it very quickly again afterwards. Property transactions are back, and also many of the small companies have come back to work. So it's true, on the economy is really getting back to speed, of course, with a very low visibility on how things will shake out going forward. But at the moment, everything is on the economic side, seems like a very sharp V-shape coming back. If you go to the next slide, please. Slide 20, exactly. We are still not back to normal, though. If you look at social life and indicators that measure that, we are still in a very special situation here. The metro lines, public transport is only 50% full. Sales in department stores are still down because people don't go out as much. Restaurants, hotel, household management services, all those things that need people interaction are only a third of what it was before the crisis. Flights are still down. And recently, last weekend, we had the annual Qingming Festival with a lot less travel to popular sites than before. Box office, for example, 0%, or cinemas still closed. Personally, I cannot have any visitors at home because the neighborhood community doesn't allow it. There's still travel restrictions within China to certain cities. And if you are out, it's expected of you that you still wear the face mask, and the same is true for the office. So the economy is coming back, but life is still far away from normal. Very cautious to prevent any further emergence of that virus here. Very quickly, maybe on slide 25, and I'm sure you've read a lot about those things. I think what China did is four key things. First, they locked down the main outbreak center in Wuhan and then Hubei province. They really shut off, actually protected the rest of the country by doing that. Outside of those outbreak centers, they established quite extensive track and trace activities, similar to what Korea is doing, and quarantine periods for people traveling domestically. So we'll come to that in a second again. They use digital tools wherever, in many ways. So one of the big things is that if you want to enter an office building, you often have to show a QR code that indicates whether you're green or red, and you're green if you have not been to critical areas over the last 2 weeks. If you have been, it's red, and you better stay at home. And lastly, of course, there were stimulus packages and relief for debtors and similar activities. But one thing that was very important here is that there are actually very early clear requirements on what is needed in order to ramp up the business again. When is a factory allowed to operate again? It needed to meet certain requirements that the government set, which I think is one of the key things that actually enable companies here to relatively quickly go back to production. And from the macro level, let me take you to one of our clients that we supported during that phase on the more micro level on the next page. So we're working for a commercial vehicle manufacturer based in Beijing. They had performance issues already before the crisis, and they were hit quite hard when it happened. And let me talk a little bit about things, how they managed throughout the time. On the next page. So if you go to the next page, what you will see is that they actually weathered the storm quite well on slide 27. They had a good start to the year. The crisis, slide 27, one back please.
Sorry, I think there's a bit of a delay, but it should be there now.
No, it's there now. So they had to shut down the factory, or they always planned to shut down the factory on January 24th for Chinese New Year, and they couldn't reopen directly afterwards again, because that's exactly when the virus hit. But they were able to reopen with 1 week delay on February 8th at reduced capacity. And you see, if you look at their sales numbers, they had a big drop in sales versus the previous year in February. In March, however, they're already back to previous year's levels. And in April, the order book is very strong. The market is quite strong. And they will actually exceed and make up for some of that loss that they had in February. What did they do? The first thing they did is that they really did set up the so-called virus corona task force that had several different activities as the highest priority to make sure that the people are safe, but then also in 3 areas to make first sure that the production is secured, that the supply chain is secured, and that sales is secured. Let me go into those areas quickly. In operations, the thing I mentioned is the government, it was different by province and different by city, but everywhere there were very clear guidelines on what a factory, office needs to do in order to be allowed to operate again. It included quarantine requirements. It included wearing masks, sanitization of and use of disinfectant, temperature measurements, tracking of where everybody has been, increasing the distance between workers, eliminating break areas, replacing lunch in canteens with lunch boxes. So it was actually quite a practical long list of things, and they needed to make sure that they adhere to all of those things in order to be allowed to start operations again. On the supply chain side, of course, the whole supply chain was hit quite hard by the virus. What they needed to do, and you can imagine it's like a big wall on a big poster on the wall. For each supplier, they had to call them every day to ask, when will the parts be coming? Can you commit to a certain number of parts by when? And follow up this every day, because there was a high uncertainty in those estimates, changed all the time. So they kept track of this quite diligently. That's on the supply side and the supply chain. On the top line, they also actually reacted. They said, we can not only look at that we can keep the production running, but let's secure the top line as well, as good as we can. And maybe if you go to the next slide, I can give you some more examples of what they did on the top line on slide 28. The first thing they did is they looked at the order book. In the order book, what are critical orders that we are at risk of losing? Are there things that we can do to avoid the loss? What are given the much reduced capacity in production, they also had to reshuffle the orders. So, for example, if there was an order with the risk of it actually being lost, if it takes too long, then they put it ahead of the queue. They looked at what are the most profitable products and prioritize those as well. So this is the activities that they did at the very, very first stage, looking at the order structure and making sure they produce the most wanted products. At the same time, in automotive, you rely on your dealer base, and many of those dealers actually were in very significant financial issues, because the whole month of February, and some of them even part of March, were not allowed to open. So they checked what's the financial stability of their sales network and supported where needed. They also used the time. So this is kind of the crisis response directly. But then they actually said, okay, let's think about what can we do. And they really invested into digital ways of engaging with customers and collecting leads. So first, they trained the local dealers. They couldn't open, but they trained them in how do I reach out to customers by phone, by WeChat, WhatsApp, email, to actually generate leads. They did the same at the headquarters, where they had already last year set up some digital outreach business development unit to generate leads and give it to the dealers. and they use the time to train dealers in the new products, the new campaigns, and so on. So they use that. They also actually checked at on the demand side. There were competitors of our clients that were more hit by the crisis because of the way where they produce the trucks. So who are there opportunities in the market that we can actually gain share by going after certain customer segments that currently cannot be served by our competitors, and to get an idea of how do we stock up our dealers with which kind of products in which regions after the ramp up is happening. They very early did a lot of market research, customer service to understand what is needed to equip the dealers with the right products. And looking at the current performance, they have been able to outperform the market and actually weathered that initial storm quite well doing those things. What we've done, if you look at the next slide, we have synthesized that response in I think in 4 action fields where you could take those learnings. One is the crisis management. You need to in all ways look at your financials, do contingency planning. This is where you do your scenarios. Have a strong communication with your staff on what is going on. All those things. Then you need to respond. You protect your workforce. You protect your company. Then you prepare for this ramp up across all areas of the value chain. And that's I think the phase that we are here in now, but many companies will also get to. If you think about how do I build a competitive advantage coming out of this. So if I weathered the storm well, I was well prepared for the ramp up, there are actually my opportunities. In the M&A space, are there structural changes I was not able to do before, but now I am. So that's the things that we are now actively thinking through with the client here. With that would be my practical report from China.
Great, thanks so much, Thomas. And I think that does leave us 10 minutes or so for questions. And so I see a number of questions have been submitted. And so Maxwell, maybe just orient us to what you'd most like to discuss. Great. Hey, Maxwell. Do you want to pick some of the questions, or should we just look at them and pick a couple?
Right. Sorry about that. I actually noticed that my remote, my mic was on mute. So I just wanted to say thank you, Francois, Mills, and Thomas for that. It's been really great. I think the insights are very, very valuable. We've received several questions here. We'll do our best to, try and answer as many of them as possible within the short period of time that we have. To start us off, I think there's an interesting question here that I'll just throw out, and one of you can answer this. So Danielle is asking that given the current disruption of global supply chains across the world, is there an opportunity for Kenya and Africa's industrialization processes to take off? What are your thoughts on that?
Yeah, I'm happy to start, and then I think great if our other experts can jump in. I mean, I see a lot of opportunity, and I think about it in 2 elements. One is because of existing supply chain disruption, we're seeing a number of things getting insourced, and so I can't source PPEs, and so now we're making hand sanitizers in Kenya. We're making face masks. That's a small example. There are plenty of other sort of more industrial or manufacturing oriented examples. And I think the question for that activity is, what is the long-term viability of that activity? I also think there's a more strategic exercise, which, I would love to see happen in Kenya, which is, given global disruptions in supply chain, I think a lot of, big companies are essentially rethinking their supply chain. So if I was, 90%, in China or, heavily concentrated in one part of the world, shocks like this make people rethink the viability of, concentration of supply chains, et cetera. And I think, Kenya has an opportunity and Africa has an opportunity to, be strategic about identifying opportunities. What has been disrupted, where we can be competitive, and how do we, institute a set of policies and actions that encourage, more production in Kenya. So that's how I've thought about that one. But let me pause there and see if anyone has other adds.
No, I would like maybe to add one thing, because I believe that you said something which is very important, which is the question about concentration. My view is that COVID is just an accelerator of trends. It's not a game changer, it's an accelerator of trends. And we all know that for the 20s, already this question about resilience, robustness was becoming more important, because you had questions about geopolitics, you had many things. So I think that here, the question is much more about now resilience. And I think, for instance, in Europe, people believe that because of that, it will be, let's say, lots of industries will get reshored and will be back to Europe. I think that maybe yes, maybe no. Instead of thinking about concentration in one place or in the other, what is important is to be robust, and therefore to diversify your sources of opportunities. And therefore, I think that in Africa, you might have some and so on, but it's really about resilience. And of course, this will create redundancies, and these redundancies have a cost. And this is why companies that will really implement artificial intelligence are more likely to be able to decrease this additional cost. So I think that there are opportunities for Africa, because it's not reshoring where the consumers are, but it's resilience, and therefore making your supply chain more robust.
All right. Well, thank you for that. The next question from Janet Mackenzie of HSC. She's asking about SMEs, which, as you know, are the bedrock of our economy. And the question is, what can SMEs do to try and mitigate this crisis to really help those companies stay afloat and keep people in jobs? Are there any lessons from other countries that you can share around this?
Yes, what I can share is the fact that the question is, of course, SMEs can do something. I will come back to that, but governments might do a lot. So it's absolutely important to keep in mind that it's up to the government to a certain extent to put the environment that will help SMEs continue their job. And it is about making sure that you have enough liquidity in the banks so that they can still play their role to in giving loans and so on. So this is very important. And of course, to make sure that, for instance, I don't know about the tax systems, but for instance, in Europe, we have some, let's say, additional elements for, let's say, unemployment or partial, what we call temporary unemployment and so on. So I think that, first of all, it's very important for the governments to take the breadth and the depth of the crisis. And in terms of the amount that is likely to be needed, I was discussing with some very good economists, and their point of view is to say, okay, you need to have a system that will give as much money in the system as you have, as you are hit by the crisis. So the plans, if you have let's say a GDP decreasing by 10%, basically the amount of investment policy, both policy and monetary and fiscal policy, should be around the same order of magnitude. So I would say this is from the government point of view. From the SME point of view, I think that they can do things, and I think that there are things that can be done if you think about, and you can get some lessons from China as well. And we have an article on HBR that was, let's say, referring to this, but it's important for you to revisit your, let's say, your distribution channels. So for instance, it's probably the moment to try to accelerate digitalization. And we have examples where, for instance, a large cosmetic company in China, they were clothing their, let's say, their stores, and what they did, that they put their salespeople as influencers on the net, and they were able to increase their sales quite significantly. You have, so going there, making sure that you try, there will be, for instance, industries where that will increase. And for instance, if you take restaurants in China, because they had no one, of course they tried to do, they went on site, they went online and were doing the home delivery, but they were as well limiting their cost and proposing their manpower to, let's say, Alibaba, was really, which was really trying to get some additional, that was really lacking resources to face the increase in delivery. So there are many things, very practical things, to try to limit the loss of cash, to try to variabilize your cost structure, and trying to increase and to rebalance maybe your channels to make sure that you can get some revenues and you can adapt to that. So there are lessons to be learned from other countries.
Okay, fantastic, great. I think we can squeeze in two other questions. There's several of them, and we just have to apologize in advance. We will not be able to take all the questions given the time limits that we have. This question is from Rupert, and Rupert is asking about dispute resolution. It is clear that there's going to be a significant amount of disputes that would need to be resolved, especially when we get to the recovery phase. How do you think the East African businesses can work collectively in resolving these disputes? So more of mediation rather than engaging in expensive and what's likely to be very long and uncertain litigation processes. Is this something that you're seeing maybe from your engagements? What sort of advice would you give around that?
That's one, honestly, where I haven't, I don't have a perspective from Kenya or from East Africa. I don't know if if our China team or global team has anything to say on that one.
Yeah, are you referring to mitigation of the virus over time, or?
No, dispute litigation. So there's bound to be a lot of situations where there's a lot of legal issues coming up due to contracts not being serviced and so on, especially when you get to the recovery phase. So the question here is, is there a way, or is there some precedents that companies can look at when it comes to trying to resolve this?
So I do not have the experience. I know from our client here that a lot of suppliers had to invoke force majeure clauses on not being able to deliver some parts, for example. But that's not my area of expertise.
Yeah, I mean, I think it's honestly, I think it's more of a sort of a legal question. So
yes.
I don't know if we're best positioned.
All right,
so,
great.
So we know we are not well positioned to answer this one.
All right, thank you. Just one last question, and this is relating to scenario planning that you talked about. Just some practical steps that you can give the companies here and how to approach this, I think would be great, because I know most companies are really struggling with how do they, draw up various scenarios, how do they get themselves to start thinking about the recovery, and so on and so forth. So can you just share a few insights around that, just some practical steps that companies can start taking regarding that?
So, I don't know, Thomas, if you want, or I can take it as you wish.
With scenario planning, I think maybe so I can only give you the practical advice is that from day one they started to doing scenarios. They do the most likely for next week, and then they had outlooks for the next half year and the next full year, and they updated those scenarios quite regularly. But I mean, and I think how they developed them, they had a higher case and lower cases, very pragmatic the way they did it. But,
and just to just to pile on there, I mean, I think this is a topic that's not just relevant for, businesses, but we're also, doing scenario planning for ministries of health around Africa, and trying to look. So I think there's multiple elements of it. One is sort of epidemiological, and so what do analogs say about how the disease can progress? And I think you need to have a low scenario and a high scenario, and probably something in the middle. You also need to be thinking about time horizons, and so short term, medium term, long term. What we're working now to do is to try to link the epidemiological scenarios to the economic impact, and working with organizations like the World Food Program to say, okay, what does the epidemiological scenario tell you about food disruption and basic necessity and service disruptions? And I think it's that type of thinking that businesses need to be doing. And so, based on your belief about epidemiology, what is the impact to your business, given the various measures that are likely to persist or not, depending on, how the disease progresses.
And if I may add one thing. So first of all, I'm writing an article on this topic that I will forward to you so that you can distribute it. It should be ready by next week. But one more thing on top of what you said about the 3 time horizons, what I call the lockdown, the transition, and the new normal, is about the supporting organization structure. What we see is the fact that it's very difficult for the same team to look at 2 different time horizons. So what we push for is to have one which is really dedicated to the response, what we call the COVID response office, that will define and implement the actions to fight the crisis, business continuity, and so on. So they are really this is a response office. And then you have, let's say, an intelligence and anticipation office that will work more on the scenarios, and that will be developing action plan for the transition period and set strategic orientations for the new normal era. And I think that it's important to start these 2 offices as of today. And even if it can be a bit difficult, let's say, in mind that, let's say, the executive committee members and especially the CEO should spend most of his or her time on the anticipation office, because let's say a former prime minister during World War I, a French one, Georges Clemenceau, was saying that it's difficult to win the war, it's even more to win the peace. And he knows what he's talking about, as he lost it. But I think that you need not only to deal with what you have to do immediately, but to try to think about a longer term horizon, and to have probably 2 separate teams to do that.
Okay, fantastic, thank you. Mills, there's several questions coming through, and I'm thinking we'll probably just bunch up this and find a way of communicating on big buckets around the themes that we're seeing coming across in the interest of time. And then would it be possible for us to share this presentation with the panel?
Yeah, absolutely. We'll PDF it and send it around to the group. And I would also just say, if anyone's curious to have a follow-up discussion, happy to do that. Just to be respectful of our guest speakers' time, I want to let them go. But thank you everyone for attending, and again, happy to follow up.
Okay, fantastic. Now, thank you very much. We've come to the end of our webinar this morning. I really hope everybody has taken away value as I have. I want to say a special thank you to the BCG team for their partnership and great insights this morning. Thank you, Mills, Francois, and Thomas. And thank you all for participating in today's webinar. Have a great day and be safe. Thank you.
Thank you.
Thanks, everyone.
Thank you.